Arsène Lupin and the Mystery of the Cursed Jewels. Chapter 1. The Phantom's Invitation. Paris, the city of lights, where everything sparkles, yet shadows lurk in every corner. It was one of those warm autumn evenings when the air, though tinged with the cold breath of approaching winter, held just enough sweetness to remind you that life was still good. The streets bustled, as always, with carriages and pedestrians, while the cafes were filled with the murmur of conversation and the clinking of glasses. The social elite, with their polished manners and their pearls of wisdom, held their various parties and soirees as if to escape the dullness of the day and enter the world of glamour they so dearly adored. On this particular evening, the great mansion of Victor de Valmont, one of Paris's wealthiest industrialists, played host to an extravagant gala. The invitation to the event had gone to all those whose names glittered in the social register. Everyone, it seemed, except one person. And yet the city's most infamous figure had not been forgotten, not by a long shot. Arsène Lupin, the gentleman thief, had received no invitation, nor did he expect one. Invitations were for those who lived by the rules. Lupin had long since made a name for himself as someone who lived by his own laws, his own code of honor. His wit, his charm, his daring, the very things that kept the police department on edge and the upper crust of society in constant fear, were the weapons he wielded most skillfully. To his fans, he was an enigma wrapped in a mystery, and to his enemies, he was the thief of thieves. But on this particular evening, Lupin was not planning to steal anything, at least not at first. No, tonight he was to be the ghost at the feast, the shadow that flitted through the mansion unnoticed. He had a far more interesting game in mind. From the shadows of the Rue de la Paix, he observed the grand façade of de Valmont's mansion. Light spilled from every window, the laughter of the guests echoing into the cool night. There were men in tuxedos, women in shimmering gowns, their jewels sparkling under the chandeliers. This was the sort of event Lupin could never resist. Not that he cared for the guests. No, it was the challenge of entering uninvited, of mingling with the elite without them knowing that their greatest adversary was among them. Lupin smiled to himself as he adjusted his dark coat, concealing the finely tailored outfit beneath. A hat tipped low over his face, and a mask concealed his identity, allowing him to blend into the crowd. It was the perfect disguise. Not a single person in that room would have the slightest inkling that the most wanted man in France had slipped past the gates and was now inside their very midst. He walked toward the entrance, his steps measured, calm. He had a destination, the ballroom, the very heart of the party, where de Valmont would no doubt be holding court, surrounded by sycophants and admirers. Lupin had heard whispers of a new collection of rare jewels that the industrialist had recently acquired, an acquisition that had stirred the curiosity of many. And Lupin, always one to appreciate exquisite treasures, had his own interest in these jewels. But for now they were not his prize. Tonight he was here for something far more valuable, the opportunity to watch, to learn, and perhaps to manipulate. As Lupin neared the entrance, he slowed, catching sight of the doorman. The tall man in a velvet uniform gave him a cursory glance. No recognition. Perfect. Lupin straightened his posture and adjusted his gloves, keeping his head low. The doorman nodded and opened the door without hesitation. "Good evening, sir. Welcome." Lupin stepped inside. The chandelier above sent a cascade of golden light down, illuminating the grand ballroom. Music played softly in the background, a string quartet positioned near the windows, while the guests drifted in clusters, laughing and talking, Their attention was focused elsewhere, leaving Lupin to slip through the crowd unnoticed. He spotted de Valmont immediately, a tall man with sharp features, his beard carefully groomed, and his eyes gleaming with a hint of arrogance. De Valmont's appearance was impeccable, but Lupin knew that appearances could be deceiving. Beneath that polished exterior, there was something darker, something dangerous that Lupin would uncover in due time. "Ah, Lupin," he muttered to himself, his lips curling into a grin. "It seems even the great industrialists are no strangers to a little deception." It was not long before Lupin began to hear whispers about the shadow. The Parisian underworld was rife with rumors, though none dared speak the name aloud. It was said that the shadow had pulled off a series of remarkable heists across Europe, each more daring than the last. Unlike Lupin, who relished in his role as a charming rogue, the shadow was a ghost, a presence that left no trace, no clue, no evidence. He simply took and vanished into the night as though he were never there. The jewels. Lupin's attention turned to a display in the center of the room, beneath a gilded dome of glass. There, on velvet cushions, rested an array of rare gems, a collection so spectacular it almost seemed too good to be true. Diamonds, emeralds, sapphires, each more magnificent than the last. Lupin's sharp eyes assessed every piece. These weren't merely precious stones. They were symbols of power, of wealth, of status. He approached slowly, casually, until he was no more than a few steps away. His eyes danced over the jewels, taking in every detail, committing it all to memory. The display was heavily guarded, but Lupin had no doubt that the challenge would be as easy as a game of cards. Tonight, he had no intention of stealing them. No, his purpose here was far more subtle. A slight rustle in the crowd caught his attention. Lupin turned his head to find a woman moving toward the display, a striking woman, tall, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. She was dressed in a gown of deep purple silk, the kind of gown that could only belong to someone of immense wealth. But there was something about her, something familiar. Her gaze lingered on the jewels, and for a brief moment, Lupin saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Was it greed? Or perhaps something deeper, more dangerous? It wasn't long before Lupin found himself embroiled in conversation with her, a casual exchange that soon grew more intriguing. She spoke of the jewels with an almost reverent tone, her words laced with an intensity that caught his attention. Lupin listened closely, sensing that there was more to this woman than met the eye. "I'm afraid you may be mistaken," she said with a wry smile. "These jewels are no mere trinkets. They are cursed." "Cursed?" Lupin raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And how is it that a cursed collection has found its way into the hands of so many?" "Ah, that is the question, isn't it? The truth of it all lies in the past, in the secrets that no one is brave enough to uncover." Lupin's mind raced. A cursed collection? What was it that de Valmont wasn't telling the guests? What was it that this woman knew? Just then, a sudden commotion drew the attention of the guests. Lupin turned sharply. The display case, empty. The jewels were gone. The crowd gasped in shock. Security rushed to the scene, but it was already too late. Lupin's smile deepened, a glimmer of admiration for the one who had executed this perfect crime. Whoever it was, they were clever. Clever enough to slip past the watchful eyes of de Valmont's staff, and Lupin, ever the observer, had just learned a valuable lesson. He was not the only one in Paris who could pull off a perfect heist. The game, it seemed, had only just begun. Chapter 2. The Rival's Mask. The city of Paris awoke the next morning to find itself still reeling from the audacious theft that had occurred the previous night. At the grand gala held at Victor de Valmont's mansion, the prized jewels, rumoured to be of ancient origin and steeped in mystery, had vanished under the noses of the finest minds in French society. The scandal was not only one of magnitude, but one that questioned the very idea of security in a world of wealth and influence. And yet, for Arsène Lupin, the events of the evening were nothing more than the opening of a much larger play, one that he had no intention of losing. Lupin, however, was not concerned with the loss of jewels. No, his mind was focused entirely on something else. The theft, though masterfully executed, was not his work. No, this was the work of someone else, someone who, like Lupin, possessed the same cunning, the same audacity. But where Lupin was a gentleman with charm and wit, this other figure, whom he had come to call the Shadow, was a far darker and more elusive presence. Lupin had long known that his fame attracted both admirers and rivals, but this new adversary was unlike any he had encountered before. From the moment Lupin had seen the woman in the purple silk gown standing before the display of jewels, he had suspected that there was more to the night than mere theft. She was the perfect distraction, and yet she knew far too much about the jewels' curse to be anything other than involved. But Lupin's instincts, honed over years of outsmarting both lawmen and criminals alike, told him that the woman was not the mastermind. She was simply another piece in the game. The reports of the Shadow's latest crime, the theft of de Valmont's jewels, sent the police into a frenzy. Inspector Gérard Duval, Paris's most persistent detective, was called in to investigate, and Lupin could almost hear the detective's heavy footsteps as he arrived at the scene. Duval, who had pursued Lupin across Europe for years without success, was no stranger to failure. Yet every time he thought he had Lupin cornered, the thief would slip away, leaving the inspector with nothing but a bitter sense of frustration. But this time, Duval was not chasing Lupin. No, this time, the detective was hunting the shadow of a man, a phantom whose very existence seemed to elude him. Lupin, ever the observer, kept close tabs on the investigation, certain that the police would eventually lead him straight to the shadow. It wasn't long before Lupin received a letter sent to him in a peculiar manner, by hand wrapped in a silver ribbon, sealed with a crest he did not recognize. The letter, though unsigned, was a challenge, one that Lupin could not resist. "The Shadow calls on you, Lupin. Come and prove your worth. The game has begun, and your every move is being watched. But beware, for not all is as it seems. There is more at play here than jewels and masks. The time is nigh for you to meet the one who will best you." Lupin smiled as he read the letter. The words, cryptic and full of hidden meaning, were exactly the sort of riddle he relished. The Shadow was making his move, and Lupin knew it was time to act. But he would not rush headlong into this contest. No, Lupin was a man of patience, a man who understood the value of a well-played hand. Later that evening, as the moonlight bathed the streets of Paris in silver, Lupin made his way to the appointed rendezvous, an abandoned building on the edge of Montmartre. It was the perfect setting for confrontation, a place where shadows could blend with the darkness, where every movement would be shrouded in mystery. As Lupin entered the building, he could feel the tension in the air. The silence was oppressive, and the only sound was the soft echo of his footsteps as he moved deeper into the shadows. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he saw the outlines of figures in the distance, figures that were not there moments ago. "Ah, Lupin," came a voice from the darkness, smooth and deliberate. "I knew you would come. No one can resist a challenge such as mine." Lupin's sharp eyes narrowed, and his lips curled into a wry smile. Standing before him was a figure cloaked in black, a mask covering most of his face, his eyes gleaming with a cold, unsettling intensity. This was the Shadow, the man whose name had been whispered in fear, the man whose brilliance rivaled Lupin's own. "Who are you?" Lupin asked, his voice laced with amusement. "Another thief in the night, or something more?" The Shadow's laugh echoed through the room, cold and mocking. "Ah, Lupin, always the charming rogue. You don't need to know who I am. What matters is what I represent. You see, we are not so different, you and I, but I am the one who operates in the shadows, the one who does not play by the rules." Lupin stepped forward, his demeanor calm, his posture confident. "You misunderstand me, my friend. I don't need to play by the rules either, but I play the game better than you." For a moment, the two men stood in silence, sizing each other up. There was a tension between them, one that neither had anticipated, but both recognized immediately. This was no ordinary rivalry. It was a contest of minds, a battle for supremacy, a struggle for the title of Paris's greatest thief. "You may have outwitted the police," the Shadow said, his tone dripping with disdain, "but you will not outwit me. I will take what I want, and I will leave you in the dust." Lupin's eyes flashed with a spark of excitement. "Then let's see who is truly the better thief. The game is on, my friend. Let us see who can truly master the art of deception." With that, Lupin turned on his heel and disappeared into the darkness, his figure vanishing like a ghost. The Shadow stood motionless, watching him go, his eyes narrowing in determination. The game had begun, and neither side would rest until the final move was made. But Lupin knew something that the Shadow did not. In this game, the shadows themselves would become the most dangerous weapon of all. Chapter 3. The Woman in the Mirror. The morning after Lupin's cryptic meeting with the Shadow found Paris bathed in the soft, golden light of an autumn sun. The usual bustle of the city, its horse-drawn carriages, its market vendors calling out from the cobbled streets, the clatter of cafe cups, seemed to have little effect on the growing tension in Lupin's mind. For weeks now, an invisible game had been set in motion, its rules unclear, but its stakes perilously high. He had faced many rivals, outwitted the most formidable opponents, but this new enemy, the Shadow, was different. His every move was calculated, and every step seemed to leave Lupin one step behind. It was a thrill, a challenge, a puzzle to be unraveled. But it was not just the Shadow who occupied Lupin's thoughts that day. The mysterious woman in the purple silk gown, the one who had been so intently watching the display of jewels the previous evening, still lingered in his memory. There was something about her, something that gnawed at him, something that suggested she was more than just a passing player in this intricate game of thieves and deception. Her knowledge of the cursed jewels, her eyes that had held such a secret intensity as they met his across the ballroom. It was not something a mere bystander would possess. Lupin had known that the woman would be trouble from the moment their paths crossed. The way she had spoken of the jewels, the curse, had struck him with an odd feeling of familiarity. The pieces of the puzzle were still scattered, but Lupin knew one thing for certain. This woman was a key figure in the mystery that was slowly unfolding before him. It did not take long for Lupin to arrange a meeting with her. His reputation, after all, was known to many, and though he was a master of disguise, his presence in the social circles of Paris was always felt. A brief word here, a name dropped there, and a rendezvous was set at the quaint and somewhat inconspicuous Café de l'Opéra, a place frequented by artists, musicians, and lovers alike. There, among the soft hum of conversation and the clink of porcelain cups, Lupin awaited his guest. He arrived early, as he always did. not because he was anxious, but because he enjoyed observing the world around him before it unfolded into the usual chaos. As he sipped his espresso, Lupin's mind continued to spin with the fragments of the puzzle, the stolen jewels, the shadow's elusive nature, and the woman whose beauty, mystery, and secretive manner were fast becoming an obsession. Who was she, and why had she appeared just when Lupin needed a clue? At precisely 3:30, she arrived. She entered the cafe with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly, like a creature of the night who had wandered into the daylight. The woman in the purple silk gown was now dressed in a simple, elegant black dress, but the same air of quiet sophistication surrounded her. She scanned the room quickly, her eyes settling on Lupin with a look of recognition. She walked toward him with a slight, knowing smile, and Lupin rose to meet her. "Mr. Lupin," she said, her voice smooth, yet with a hint of something darker beneath the surface. "I trust you are well." Lupin nodded, offering his most charming smile. "Indeed, mademoiselle, I am as well as ever. I trust you found your way here without trouble?" She sat across from him, the slightest hint of tension in her posture as she arranged her gloves neatly on the table. "The streets of Paris are always full of surprises," she replied, her eyes glinting with an unspoken meaning. "But I am quite used to them by now." Her tone was casual, but Lupin could tell that beneath it lay a mind as sharp as his own. She was playing a game, but what game was it? "I assume, mademoiselle, that you did not come here today simply to discuss Parisian streets," Lupin said, leaning forward slightly, his gaze never leaving her face. "I know that you have some interest in the jewels, those cursed jewels that were stolen from de Valmont's collection. I confess I am curious as to why." She paused, her lips curling into a slight smile. "You are perceptive, Mr. Lupin. I had hoped you would be." "Yes, I have an interest in those jewels, but it is not the curse that intrigues me. It is the power they represent. Power that many have sought to control, and power that, as you might suspect, has a very long history." Lupin's curiosity deepened. "And what is this power? A power you would be willing to seek even at the risk of your own life?" She tilted her head slightly as if considering whether to answer. "You are an ambitious man, Mr. Lupin. I have seen the way you operate, your skill, your craft. You play with danger the way a master painter plays with color, but unlike you, I have no time for games." Her eyes locked with his, cold and direct. "I am not interested in the jewels for their beauty, or even for the money they would bring. I am after something far more valuable." Lupin raised an eyebrow. "And what would that be?" The woman leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering. "The truth, Mr. Lupin, the truth that lies behind the curse, the truth of who stands behind these robberies. You see, the jewels are not merely valuable because of their monetary worth. They are pieces of a puzzle that, once completed, will reveal a secret that could shake the very foundation of Paris." Lupin's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place. The shadow was not just a common thief. No, this was far deeper. A conspiracy, perhaps, with forces at play that Lupin had yet to understand fully. The woman before him, though she spoke of truth and secrets, was as much a part of this tangled web as anyone else. But what role did she play? "You know something, don't you?" Lupin said quietly, leaning in, his voice a whisper. "You know the identity of the shadow, don't you?" The woman's eyes flickered, the briefest shadow passing across her face. But it was enough. Lupin had his answer. "I know more than you think, Mr. Lupin," she said softly. "But not everything is as it seems. The shadow is only the beginning. There are those who have been manipulating events from the very start, pulling strings that even you cannot see. Lupin straightened, a new resolve hardening within him. He was no longer dealing with a mere thief or even a rival. He was tangled in something far larger, something that would require all of his skill, all of his craft to untangle. The woman reached into her bag and pulled out a small silver key. "This," she said, placing it in front of Lupin, "is the key to unlocking the next piece of the puzzle. But be warned, Mr. Lupin, some truths are better left hidden." Lupin took the key, his fingers brushing hers in a moment of silent understanding. He was deep in this game now, deeper than he had ever anticipated, and there would be no turning back. "Then I shall see it through," he said, standing and offering her a bow. "Until next time, mademoiselle." As she walked away, Lupin stood watching her, the weight of the key in his pocket, a constant reminder of the danger and the mystery that awaited. The shadows were closing in, and Lupin knew that only one thing was certain. This was far from over. Chapter 4. The Silver Key. The night was unusually still for Paris, the thick fog rolling in from the Seine, cloaking the city in an eerie silence. For once, the relentless hum of the streets seemed to have taken a pause, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Lupin, ever attuned to the rhythms of Paris, could not help but feel that this calm was the eye of a storm that had been brewing for some time and was now on the verge of breaking. The events of the past few days had set into motion a series of revelations that Lupin could no longer ignore. The woman in the purple gown, the key to the puzzle, no doubt, had slipped into his thoughts like a persistent shadow. Her cryptic words echoed in his mind, the key to unlocking the next piece of the puzzle. And she had given him just that, a small silver key. It had been a simple object, delicate and unassuming, but Lupin knew better than to underestimate its significance. The engraving on its surface, a curious symbol of intertwining shapes, was enough to tell him that it was no mere trinket. This key had a purpose, a destination, and it was now his to discover. The address he had been given, one that had seemed so innocuous at first glance, was a small manor on the outskirts of Paris, nestled in the shadows of the city's more affluent districts. A place untouched by the hustle and bustle of the urban life, a place where secrets could be hidden away without fear of discovery. Lupin had been there before, many years ago, under a different name, under different circumstances. But now the manor was nothing more than another piece of the puzzle, a puzzle that he had yet to solve. As he approached the manor, Lupin was aware of the stillness surrounding him. The air was thick with mystery, and every step he took seemed to reverberate in the quiet of the night. The mansion loomed ahead, its windows dark, its doors locked as if daring anyone to approach. But Lupin was not one to be deterred by a locked door. In fact, a locked door only fueled his curiosity, and his curiosity, as always, proved to be his greatest asset. Lupin had not come alone. There was a man, an old acquaintance from his more youthful days, whom he had recruited for this particular task. François Dufresne, a locksmith of unparalleled skill, had once helped Lupin out of a tight spot. Tonight he was to assist Lupin in breaking into the manor's hidden chamber, a chamber Lupin was certain held the answers he sought. "Are you certain about this, Lupin?" Dufresne asked, his voice low and cautious, as he stood beside the mansion's main gate. "This place has not been visited for years. There are rumors, whispers, that the place is cursed, that something foul happened inside those walls." Lupin smiled, his eyes gleaming with that familiar, mischievous spark. "A curse, François? You know I have little time for such superstitions." "No, the only thing I'm interested in tonight is the truth, and this key will lead us to it." With that, Lupin took the small silver key from his coat pocket, holding it up to the dim light of the street lamp. He examined it closely, his sharp eyes catching the slightest glint of the engraving. The key was a work of art, delicate, precise. Lupin turned it in his fingers as though it were a puzzle in itself, and then nodded to Dufresne. "The lock," Lupin said, his voice steady, "will yield to us in time." Dufresne nodded grimly, his weathered hands already at work on the lock. Lupin watched with a sense of impatience, his mind racing with the possibilities that lay behind the locked door. He had learned to be patient, of course, but every moment spent waiting felt like an eternity when he was so close to uncovering the truth. The minutes stretched on as Dufresne worked with practiced ease. There was no sound except the soft clicking of the lock and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. At last, after what felt like an age, Dufresne stood back, a satisfied look on his face. "It's open," he said. Lupin stepped forward, his heart pounding with excitement, and pushed the door gently open. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, but Lupin could make out the faint outlines of furniture and what appeared to be a large, ornate chest against the far wall. There was something strangely oppressive about the air inside the manor, an atmosphere that seemed to press against him as if the very walls were keeping secrets. "After you, Lupin?" Dufresne muttered, stepping aside. Lupin's eyes narrowed, his gaze scanning the room for anything out of the ordinary. He had no time to waste, no time for distractions. His fingers brushed the cold surface of a nearby table, and he allowed himself a moment of reflection. This was it. The next step. The key had brought him here, and now he would find the answers he sought. He crossed the room slowly, each step measured, each movement deliberate. As he approached the chest, his hand lingered on the latch. A part of him hesitated, the smallest trace of doubt flickering in his mind. But then he remembered the woman in the purple gown, her dark eyes piercing his soul, and he knew that the answer lay inside. Lupin lifted the chest's heavy lid. Inside, resting on a velvet cushion, was an object that took his breath away, a book. Bound in deep, rich leather, the book had an air of antiquity about it, and yet it was perfectly preserved. The cover was embossed with the same intricate symbol that had been engraved on the silver key. It was a symbol Lupin recognized, one that he had seen only once before, in an obscure document hidden in the archives of a long-dead nobleman. He reached for the book, his fingers trembling ever so slightly as they brushed against its cover. It was as though the object were alive, pulsing with a strange, hidden energy. Lupin could feel his pulse quicken as he opened the book to its first page. The words inside were written in a script that Lupin did not immediately recognize, but the meaning was clear. It was a ledger of names, names that spanned centuries. And as he continued to read, his mind raced with the realization of what he was holding. This book was not merely a ledger, it was a record of a secret society, one whose influence had spread throughout the centuries, its tendrils reaching into every facet of French society. Lupin's heart skipped a beat. This was no ordinary heist. This was far more dangerous, far more complex than he had ever imagined. He slammed the book shut, his mind reeling with the implications. But before he could react, a sudden noise behind him broke the silence. Footsteps approaching, deliberate and heavy. Lupin's instincts kicked in immediately. He motioned to Dufresne, signaling him to retreat. The game was far from over, and Lupin knew that whoever was approaching would stop at nothing to keep the secrets of the manor hidden. As the footsteps drew nearer, Lupin's eyes locked on the silver key in his hand. He had the answers. Now it was time to find out just how deep the conspiracy went. The truth he realized, was far more dangerous than any duel, and in this game he would have to stay one step ahead. With a final glance at the chest, Lupin made his move, vanishing into the shadows of the manor, leaving the past and the mystery behind him for now. Chapter 5. The clock strikes midnight. The fog had settled thick over Paris, transforming the grand city into a ghostly labyrinth. Its twisting alleys and narrow streets seemed to lead into endless shadows, where even the faintest glimmer of light struggled to make its mark. Above, the sky was heavy with clouds, blocking out the moon and turning the world beneath into a murky expanse of grey. But this night, as always, Paris was alive. Its pulse quickened by the quiet whispers of secrets, the hushed conspiracies, the unseen hands that moved behind the curtains of the city's glittering facades. For Arsène Lupin, this was the perfect night, a night of uncertainty, a night of intrigue, a night where even the slightest misstep could be disastrous, but where he, the master of deception, felt most at home. He had arrived at the appointed place, a location that, on the surface, appeared as harmless as any other. Yet Lupin knew better. There was no such thing as a simple meeting when one was dealing with the shadow, the elusive figure who had somehow outwitted him at every turn. The meeting had been arranged with precision. The shadow had chosen an unlikely venue, the Banque Royale, one of the most secure institutions in the city, its vaults holding millions in wealth. Lupin had never seen such a well-guarded fortress of finance. But then again, the shadow was no fool. This was no ordinary heist. It was a game, a master stroke designed to test not just Lupin's skill, but his resolve. Lupin stood at the corner of the square, observing the grand building across the street. The flickering lights inside the Banque Royale's windows reflected the false tranquility of the evening. Through the thin veil of fog, he saw shadows moving behind the glass. Guards, sentries, and clerks going about their business, as if nothing were amiss. But Lupin knew better. The real game was already underway, and soon the clock would strike midnight. As the hour approached, Lupin's mind raced with the pieces he had gathered. The ledger from the hidden manor had opened his eyes to something far more disturbing than he had anticipated. A web of conspiracies so vast it seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of what was possible. The ledger had named names, but it had also hinted at something darker, something more powerful than even the shadow could comprehend. The jewels, the secret society, and the conspiracy to control the wealth of France. They were all tied together, each thread pulling tighter and tighter. He could almost feel the shadow's presence now, the air around him thick with the unmistakable tension of a well-played trap. Lupin smiled wryly. It was a familiar sensation all the moment before the storm. His instincts told him that tonight, at long last, he would learn the truth about his elusive rival. The city clock tower struck 11 and the chimes rang out, echoing through the night. Lupin's gaze never wavered from the Banque Royale. He had a role to play, a mask to wear, and he intended to play it to perfection. His fingers brushed the edges of the velvet-lined collar of his coat, adjusting it as he prepared for what would come next. The night was still, but the tension was palpable. Lupin's sharp eyes caught the faint movement of a figure at the bank's entrance. Another shadow in the fog, a man who did not belong. With practiced ease, Lupin slipped into the crowd, blending with the anonymity of the masses. He had no doubt that the shadow was close. In fact, he was almost certain that the other man was watching him, testing him, studying his every move. As the final chime of the clock struck, Lupin took his first steps toward the Bank Royale's main doors. The guards at the entrance did not even glance in his direction. His appearance, flawless and confident, made him blend into the surroundings like an invisible thread in a tapestry. As he crossed the threshold, the sharp scent of polished wood and metal filled his nostrils, but there was no time for reflection. His mind was sharp, his senses heightened. Lupin moved quickly but with purpose, his eyes scanning the interior. It was precisely as he had expected. Ornate chandeliers, gilded columns, and floors of marble, everything designed to impress and intimidate. But none of this fazed Lupin. His goal tonight was singular, to stop the heist, but more importantly, to uncover the true identity of the Shadow. He followed the subtle clues, the unspoken signals that only someone like him could understand. A guard moving too quickly across the hall, a clerk glancing nervously at the grand clock on the wall. It was all part of the choreography, part of the dance that Lupin knew so well. Every movement in the Banque Royale was calculated, precise, but Lupin had learned long ago that the true marks of a master thief lay in the ability to read the hidden patterns, the patterns that only a few could see. He reached the central vault door with just moments to spare. His heart raced. It was now or never. Suddenly a low voice broke through the silence. "Not so fast, Lupin." Lupin turned, his mind already calculating his next move. Standing in the doorway was a figure cloaked in darkness, his features obscured by a mask. It was the Shadow, as he had known it would be. The figure stepped forward, his movements fluid, predatory. "You're quite the elusive one, aren't you?" Lupin said, his tone light, but his eyes never leaving the Shadow. "I must admit I've been rather impressed by your creativity." The Shadow stepped closer, his mask reflecting the light in strange ways. His voice was cold, almost monotone. "I'm not here to entertain you, Lupin. This is my game, and you've stepped into it one step too far." Lupin grinned. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, my friend. You see, I've been playing the game from the very beginning. I knew you were the one behind this charade the moment I received your invitation." The Shadow laughed softly, a sound that echoed in the empty vault room. "Perhaps, but you don't understand the stakes. You're out of your league now." Lupin's grin widened. "I beg to differ. I've always been quite adept at outplaying my opponents. Tell me, the Shadow, who is it that controls you? Who is it that has orchestrated this little symphony of yours?" For the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty behind the mask. The Shadow's hand moved to the inside pocket of his coat, and Lupin's senses went on high alert. This was it. The final move. But before either of them could make a move, a sudden crash sounded from behind, followed by a flurry of footsteps. Lupin turned sharply, recognizing the unmistakable sound of approaching law enforcement. Inspector Duval no doubt had tracked them down at last. In an instant Lupin acted. He darted forward, drawing on his years of experience. With a swift motion, he wrenched open the vault door, exposing the hidden treasure within. The jewels, the source of all of this madness, lay in plain view. The Shadow hesitated, but only for a moment. Then, with a sudden shift, he darted toward the jewels, but Lupin was faster. With one final movement, he slammed the door shut, trapping both himself and the Shadow inside. "You made a mistake," Lupin said, locking eyes with the rival thief, the clock now striking the final hour. "You've underestimated me." And as the final chimes of the clock echoed through the vault, Lupin knew that the game was far from over. Chapter 6. The Labyrinth of Secrets. The city of Paris, ever restless, seemed to sleep in a state of uneasy anticipation. The fog which had so often veiled the streets in a ghostly shroud had begun to lift, allowing for a clearer view of the tangled web of intrigue that had ensnared both Lupin and his elusive rival, the Shadow. But as the fog cleared, it became painfully clear to Lupin that the stakes of this game had grown far higher than he had ever anticipated. What began as a simple series of heists, an exchange of jewels, a rivalry between thieves, had now blossomed into something far more sinister. The vaults of the Banque Royale had yielded more than precious stones. They had revealed the presence of a shadowy organization with reach far beyond anything Lupin had ever encountered. The vault had contained not only the jewels, but also a set of cryptic documents that had pointed Lupin towards something even darker, a secret society that had been pulling the strings behind the scenes, manipulating the fates of the wealthiest men in Paris for decades. This was the real prize, Lupin realized. Not the jewels, not even the thefts, but the power that lay hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The symbols, the cryptic references, the names he had seen in the ledger. All of it pointed to one place, a labyrinth beneath Paris, buried deep beneath the streets in a forgotten crypt. The existence of this underground network had been whispered about for years, but few believed in its reality. Now Lupin knew that it wasn't just a myth, it was a truth, and he was about to walk its twisted paths. Lupin stood at the entrance to the narrow alley, his face obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone and the faint trace of something ancient, something that spoke of secrets long buried. A small, unmarked door at the end of the alleyway beckoned him forward. It was hidden, concealed from the unknowing, and yet it was the gateway to the heart of the conspiracy. The entrance to the labyrinth. He adjusted his coat and took a deep breath, the weight of the situation settling upon him. This was no ordinary heist. This was no mere game between two thieves. This was a journey into the unknown, a plunge into the deepest recesses of the city's hidden history. The key he had found in the manor, the one he had hidden carefully in his coat pocket, was the only means by which he could navigate this labyrinth. Without it, he would be lost. But with it, he could uncover the secrets that had been guarded for centuries. Lupin pushed open the door and descended into the darkness. The staircase was steep, winding downward into a damp, cold abyss. The only sound was the echo of his footsteps as they reverberated off the stone walls. With each step, the air grew heavier, the sense of foreboding stronger. There were no guards, no barriers to entry, just the silence of a place forgotten by time. At the bottom of the stairs, Lupin found himself in a large underground chamber. The walls were adorned with symbols and strange carvings that he couldn't quite decipher. In the center of the room stood a massive stone door, its surface covered in dust and age. At its center was a keyhole, perfectly shaped for the silver key Lupin had carried with him for days. He approached cautiously, the gravity of the situation pressing down upon him. This was it, the final step. With a steady hand, he inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click, and the massive door groaned open, revealing a passageway beyond. Lupin stepped forward, his pulse quickening. What lay beyond that door would change everything. The passage led into a series of narrow tunnels, each one twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. The walls seemed to shift in the flickering torchlight, creating an ever-changing maze. Lupin, however, had always prided himself on his ability to navigate the unknown. He had faced countless puzzles in his career, but this was different. This was a labyrinth built not by design, but by necessity. A maze of secrets and lies crafted by those who had come before him, determined to protect the truth at all costs. For what felt like hours, Lupin moved through the winding passages, his eyes sharp, his mind racing. There were no signs, no indications of where he was going, just the twisting corridors, the ancient stone, and the echoes of his own footsteps. He had expected this. The shadow had played his part well, leaving Lupin to wander through the maze without a clear sense of direction. But Lupin, as always, was prepared. He had anticipated this challenge, and he knew that it was only a matter of time before he found the answers he sought. At last, after what seemed like an eternity, he arrived at a large chamber. The air here was thick with dust, and the room seemed to pulse with an ancient energy, as though the very walls themselves were alive with secret. At the center of the room was a pedestal upon which rested an object, an ancient tome bound in leather that had long since turned to a brittle brown. The book was adorned with the same strange symbols that Lupin had seen in the ledger. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the key to unlocking the mysteries of the society that had controlled Paris for so long. Lupin approached the pedestal cautiously. He knew better than to act impulsively, especially in a place like this. Every movement, every decision could have consequences that rippled outward in ways he could not predict, but as his fingers brushed the surface of the book, he felt an undeniable pull, a sense of inevitability, as though the book were meant for him, as though it had been waiting for him to find it. His hand closed around the book, and he pulled it free from its resting place. The moment he did, the room seemed to shift around him. The walls groaned, and the floor beneath his feet trembled. Lupin's heart raced as the reality of the situation sank in. This was no ordinary book. It was something far more powerful, something that had the potential to change the very fabric of Paris itself. With the book in hand, Lupin knew that his task was far from over. He had uncovered the heart of the labyrinth, but the true mystery lay ahead. Who was behind this secret society? What were their plans? And what role did the shadow play in all of this? Before he could contemplate the answers, a sudden noise from behind him shattered the silence, the echo of footsteps, fast approaching. Lupin turned, his mind racing. There was no time to waste. He had the book. But now he needed to escape. He darted toward the exit, his pulse pounding in his ears, the labyrinth of secrets closing in behind him. This was the moment of reckoning. The game had changed, and Lupin knew that he would need every ounce of his wits to survive what lay ahead. As he reached the door, he glanced back one final time. The labyrinth was alive with the whispers of the past, its secrets, its mysteries, and its danger. And Lupin, ever the master of his own fate, was ready to confront it all. Chapter 7. The Great Deception. The world outside seemed almost too bright compared to the murky labyrinth beneath the streets of Paris. As Lupin stepped into the cool night air, the dim lanterns lining the narrow streets cast long shadows across the cobblestones. He took a deep breath, allowing the chill to clear his mind, even as his thoughts swirled with the revelations he had uncovered in the hidden chambers beneath the city. He now possessed the final piece of the puzzle, the ancient tome that had been guarded for centuries by the secret society whose name was whispered in fear. The book was both an artifact and a map, a guide that could lead him to unimaginable power. Yet, as Lupin stood in the stillness of the night, he felt an uneasy sensation, an inexplicable awareness that the ground beneath him was shifting, that he was being watched. For a moment he wondered if his rival, the shadow, had followed him out of the labyrinth, but Lupin was no stranger to danger, nor to the subtle art of deception. He had learned long ago that not everything was as it seemed, and in that moment a realization struck him. The game was not as simple as a duel between two thieves. No, the stakes had grown far higher, and the lines between friend and foe were now blurred beyond recognition. He had always prided himself on being the ultimate master of illusion, but in the presence of the shadow, Lupin had finally met his match. A rival whose cunning was as sharp as his own, a man whose every move seemed to be calculated with a level of precision that even Lupin could not predict. Yet it was this very challenge that fueled his excitement. For in the deepest corners of Paris, beneath its glittering facade, Lupin had discovered that the stakes of this game were far more dangerous than the mere pursuit of wealth. He was up against an enemy whose ambitions stretched far beyond simple thievery. Lupin's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching quickly from behind. He turned just in time to see a figure emerge from the shadows. A silhouette, familiar but unmistakably dangerous. It was a man he had not expected to see tonight, yet there was no mistaking him now. Inspector Duval. "Ah, Duval," Lupin said with a mock bow, his voice smooth and unwavering. "I wondered when you would finally catch up to me." The inspector's expression was a mixture of frustration and determination. "Lupin," Duval said through gritted teeth, "you've outsmarted me once again, but this time I won't allow you to slip away so easily." Lupin smiled, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Inspector, you wound me. Have I not been a model citizen in your eyes? Surely you've noticed my penchant for punctuality and respect for the law?" Duval's gaze hardened, his eyes never leaving Lupin. "You may be a master of disguise and deception, but you can't escape what you've done. You've caused enough damage. I've followed your trail long enough to know what you're after, and I intend to stop you." Lupin's smile widened. "Ah, but you see, Inspector, you misunderstand. I'm not the one you should be chasing. No, there's a far greater game at play here, and you're merely a pawn in it. You've been chasing me all along, but the true master of this web has been pulling your strings. Don't you see, Duval? You're part of the grand illusion." Inspector Duval's face twitched, a flicker of doubt passing through his eyes. Lupin's words had struck a nerve, but the inspector was nothing if not stubborn. "You've been deceiving everyone, Lupin. This isn't about jewels or treasure. You're after something more. You're in league with the shadow, aren't you?" Lupin tilted his head, his lips curling into a wry grin. "In league? Oh, Inspector, you wound me again. I am not a man to be in anyone's league. The shadow and I, we are merely, how shall I put it, fellow artists, each working in our own way to achieve something extraordinary." Duval's hand shot out, grabbing Lupin's arm. "Don't play games with me. Where is the shadow? What do you know about the organization behind all of this? The society that's been pulling the strings?" Lupin's gaze shifted slightly, his expression turning more serious. "Now that's the question, isn't it? You're chasing ghosts, Inspector, and you've failed to see the truth. The society you speak of, it's not some nameless group pulling the strings from the shadows. No, they're right in front of you, and you've been too focused on me to notice. The truth, Duval, is that you've been played. You, the shadow, and I, we're all just pawns in someone else's game." Duval's grip on Lupin's arm tightened. "I am done listening to your riddles, Lupin. You'll pay for your crimes, and the shadow will be exposed. I'll make sure of it." Lupin's expression softened, but his eyes remained sharp, calculating. "Inspector, you still don't understand, do you? The shadow. He's not the one you should be after. No, the true mastermind lies somewhere far more unexpected." Before Duval could respond, Lupin took a step back, his hand brushing against the inside pocket of his coat. A faint sound, barely perceptible, echoed from somewhere in the distance. Footsteps, swift and deliberate. Lupin's eyes flickered toward the source, and he felt the familiar thrill of anticipation. His rival had arrived. As if on cue, the shadow emerged from the shadows, his figure lit only by the faint glow of the street lamps. He was dressed in a dark coat, his face obscured by a mask that glinted in the light. The confrontation had been inevitable. Duval turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "The shadow," he growled, his grip loosening on Lupin's arm as he stepped toward the figure. "I've been hunting you for months. It ends tonight." But the shadow remained silent, his gaze shifting from Duval to Lupin. There was something in his eyes, something that made Lupin pause. It was a look of satisfaction, of triumph, as if this moment had been planned all along. "You've been chasing the wrong man, Inspector," Lupin said softly, his voice carrying just enough to make Duval stop in his tracks. The game was never about the shadow, it was about control. The society, the power behind the throne, is much closer than you think, and you, Duval, are far more involved than you realize. Inspector Duval's face contorted with frustration, his voice rising. "Enough with your games, Lupin. Tell me what you know." Lupin's eyes glinted with a knowing smile. "Very well. The man you've been searching for, Duval, is not the shadow. It's someone much closer to home, someone you trust, someone in plain sight." As the words hung in the air, the truth began to settle like a weight in the pit of Duval's stomach. He took a step back, his mind racing as the realization dawned upon him. Lupin smiled. "Now, Inspector, you see the truth. The real mastermind is closer than you think." With that, the stage was set for the final act of a game where nothing was as it seemed. Chapter 8. The Final Gambit. The soft, persistent patter of rain echoed against the rooftops of Paris as Lupin walked the streets under the dim glow of gas lamps. It was a night like no other, when the streets were quieter than usual, the city almost holding its breath, as if sensing that something monumental was about to unfold. Lupin's stride was measured, his every step deliberate, yet beneath the calm exterior his mind was racing. He had known that this moment would come, the culmination of months of intricate moves, counter-moves, deceptions, and games. The shadow had played his part perfectly, always one step ahead, always elusive. But Lupin had learned the rules of this game long ago. His rival had underestimated him, and now the pieces were finally falling into place. It was not just a game of thieves anymore, not merely a rivalry between two men. It was a battle of wits on a grand scale. One that had ensnared not just Lupin and the shadow, but also Inspector Duval, whose stubborn pursuit of the truth had led him to the brink of a revelation that would change everything. The secret society that had lurked behind the scenes for so long was not just a shadowy cabal of power brokers. It was a carefully constructed illusion, a labyrinth of lies that Lupin had now untangled. And tonight, the final move would be made. It would all come to a head at a private auction, to be held in the heart of Paris, where the greatest treasures of the city were to be sold to the highest bidder. Lupin had no interest in the treasures themselves. He had his own purpose for attending, one that would bring the web of deceit crashing down once and for all. The time for secrets and shadows was over. Tonight, the world will finally learn the truth. Lupin arrived at the location, a secluded mansion on the outskirts of the city, hidden behind high walls and thick ivy. The mansion was an opulent affair, its windows glowing warmly against the dark, storm-laden night. Inside, the guests had gathered, wealthy aristocrats, influential figures from the world of business and politics, each of them eager to see what treasures lay hidden behind the velvet curtains of the auction house. They were unaware that they were about to become players in the final act of a game they had never understood. Lupin made his way inside, his face obscured by a simple mask, his posture casual but alert. He was a master of disguise, and no one would recognize him tonight. His eyes scanned the room as he moved through the crowd, noting the familiar faces, the murmurs of excitement and anticipation. But his attention was focused on one figure in particular, the man he had come to see, the man who had been pulling the strings all along. The auctioneer, a tall, sharp-featured man named Jacques Dufresne, stood at the front of the room preparing for the evening's proceedings. Dufresne was an enigmatic figure known for his impeccable taste and discretion. But tonight Lupin could see the strain in his eyes, the subtle tension in his movements. Dufresne was not merely an auctioneer, he was the man behind the scenes, the one who had orchestrated the entire auction, the one who had set this game in motion. And Lupin knew that Dufresne was the key to unraveling everything. The guests took their seats as the auction began, their eyes fixed on the objects being displayed. Rare jewels, priceless artwork, and artifacts of unimaginable value. But Lupin was not interested in the treasures. His focus remained solely on Dufresne. The man was not just a collector, he was a member of the secret society, and tonight he would be unmasked. As the auctioneer's voice echoed through the room, a familiar figure stepped into the spotlight, a figure wearing a dark cloak and a mask. The shadow had arrived. Lupin's heart quickened. This was the moment. The two of them had danced this delicate waltz for far too long, and now, with the stakes higher than ever, they would finally face each other. But Lupin was not worried. He knew that he had already won. The truth had been set into motion, and nothing could stop it now. As the auction continued, Lupin watched as the shadow moved to the front of the room, his eyes scanning the crowd with a calculated coldness. There was no emotion in his gaze, no hint of recognition, no sign of the rivalry that had defined their relationship. Lupin smiled inwardly. The shadow was a master of deception, but Lupin had learned the art of manipulation long before his rival had even begun to understand it. And tonight, Lupin would play his final card. The auctioneer's voice rose as he introduced the next item. A rare manuscript said to contain the secrets of the society that had shaped Paris for centuries. The crowd fell silent, their attention fully on the book. But Lupin knew that this manuscript was more than just a historical curiosity. It was the key to everything. The moment it was revealed, the true nature of the secret society would be exposed, and the world would finally know the truth about the power that had lurked behind the scenes. But as the manuscript was unveiled, Lupin noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. A small, subtle motion, the flick of a hand, the movement of a figure in the crowd. It was Duval, the inspector, stepping into the room from the side entrance. His eyes locked onto Lupin's, and in that moment, the tension in the air seemed to shift. Duval was no longer the unwitting pawn in this game. He had become an active participant in the final gambit. Lupin watched, fascinated, as Duval moved toward Dufresne, his expression grim but determined. The two men exchanged a few quiet words, their conversation hidden from the crowd, but unmistakable to Lupin's trained eye. The inspector was closing in. But Lupin knew that Duval had underestimated the true scope of the conspiracy. The society's machinations went far deeper than even the inspector could imagine. As the bidding began, Lupin stepped forward, his movements deliberate but unhurried. He approached the auctioneer, his gaze never leaving Dufresne. And then, in one swift motion, Lupin reached into his coat pocket and produced the silver key that had been with him since the beginning of this journey. The room fell silent as Lupin placed the key onto the auctioneer's podium. This Lupin said in a voice that carried over the murmurs of the crowd, is the final piece of the puzzle, the key that unlocks not just the secrets of the society, but the very truth that has been hidden for centuries. Dufresne's face paled, and for the first time Lupin saw the faintest tremor of fear in his eyes. The auctioneer knew that his carefully constructed empire was about to collapse. Lupin's voice grew louder, more confident. Tonight, the truth will come to light. The game is over, and the society's influence over this city will end. The real mastermind has been revealed. In that instant, the room erupted into chaos. Guests scrambled, whispering in disbelief as the truth began to sink in. Duval moved toward Dufresne, his hand reaching for the auctioneer's collar as he made the arrest. But Lupin was already one step ahead. He turned to the crowd, raising his hands in mock surrender. "The game is over, gentlemen," Lupin said, his smile wide and knowing, "and the winner, as always, is Arsène Lupin." As the chaos continued around him, Lupin slipped out the side door and into the night, disappearing into the Parisian fog. The city had been his once again, and with the final gambit played, he had left behind not just a trail of deception, but a legacy that would last for years to come. The world had been fooled by the greatest thief who ever lived, and Lupin knew that no matter how many times they tried to catch him, the game would never end. It would always be his to win. Weeks passed, and the streets of Paris returned to their usual bustle, though the whispers of the events surrounding the Banque Royale and the labyrinth beneath the city persisted. Inspector Duval had declared the case closed, the jewels returned, and the vaults untouched. Well, at least, that was the official story. But the truth was far more elusive. As for Arsène Lupin, his name once again became a shadow, a legend woven into the fabric of Parisian society. The book, that ancient tome he had so carefully retrieved from the heart of the labyrinth, disappeared without a trace, as though it had never existed at all. None could say whether it had been destroyed, hidden away, or passed into the hands of those who would continue the secret society's work. The shadow was never seen again, his plans thwarted, his identity forever a mystery. But Lupin, ever the master of deception, left behind only the faintest trail, a puzzle to be solved by those who came after him. And so Arsène Lupin faded into the night, as he always did, a fleeting shadow in the ever-watchful city of Paris. His legacy, however, would remain. The ultimate thief, always a step ahead, forever a master of the game. Thank you for tuning in to Cafe Stories. If you enjoyed the intrigue and suspense, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated on more captivating adventures. Your support keeps the stories coming and the mysteries alive.